Hey boys and girls, it's Mrs. Bartel. So today with math, we are going to be trying to understand what equivalence is. So we're going to be discovering equivalent fractions. And we already have talked about this a little bit. We've talked about fractions that are equivalent. They are equal to each other. We talked about that prefix, EQUA. So equivalent fractions, they're equal to each other. And we kind of discovered this when we were making our fraction strips, those colored fraction strips. Even though you have those, I want you to cut these fraction strips out that came, that are in your math book today that came with this lesson. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to do it just like we did in class. We're going to start with one whole. So we're going to start with one whole, and we're going to label that. And then the next one we made was half. So what we did, we actually took this and we folded it in half. And then we cut it in half with our scissors right on the fold. So it's a little bit tricky for some people, cutting it right on the fold. And then we're going to label the unit fraction for both of those. So it's 1/2 and 1/2. Okay, so we have our whole and we have our 2/2, which is the same as one whole. One thing I really want to point out, boys and girls, is that the size of the whole is the same for all of these, okay? Every single fraction bar, every single whole fraction bar, they're the same. So that's super important. Otherwise, if we had 1/2, that if this was way longer, let's say that this bar was, I don't know, double the length, then quite obviously 1/2 would be the same size as the whole. We can't have that when we're comparing fractions. So when we're comparing, we're always assuming that the wholes are the same size. All right, so we have halves. I think we made thirds next. And when we did that in class, I can't actually recall. I think we actually measured, because it was 12 inches, I think we actually measured with a ruler. On this, we'll just kind of line it up here and we'll kind of estimate a little bit. So I know a third is going to be smaller than a half. So I'm going to kind of eyeball where this would be and draw lines. All three of those look pretty equal. Let me see if I'm measuring it with my fingers. A little bit of space on the right and left, a little bit of space on the right and left, a little bit of space on the right and left. They're almost, it's pretty good. I can't complain about that. So I'm going to say 1/3, 1/3. I'm going to label my unit fractions 1/3. Now, boys and girls, that's probably not exact. And if you have a ruler at home, go for it. Use it if you want to. Okay? So now I have my thirds. Now we talked about, when we're looking at the denominator, halves, thirds. So fourths would be next. Now remember, when we did fourths in the classroom, we took our whole, we folded it in half, right? We folded it in half, and then we folded each half in half. So now I'm going to take each half and fold it in half, and I'll have 4 equal pieces. This is going to be painfully long, boys and girls, because I'm not working quickly enough. All right, so if we're going to label those, 1/4, 1/4, 1/4, 1/4. Now, I'm going to skip doing fifths, boys and girls. I don't recall if we did that in class or not, but we'll have halves, thirds, fourths. I'm going to skip the fifths, and we're going to do sixths. Think about what double 3 is. Double 2 is 4. So if we took our halves and we cut it in half, we got fourths. So if we cut our thirds in half, we will have sixths. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to get my fourths out of the way. What I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of line up where I had my thirds here. I'm going to kind of line that up. So each of these is a third. Now I'm going to cut my thirds in half, and that'll give me my sixths. So, and I'm going to label these 1/6, 1/6, 1/6, 1/6, 1/6, and 1/6. And to save time, boys and girls, I'm not going to cut mine apart anymore because we need to move on. So if I'm doing, and we didn't do sevenths, I'm going to do eighths next. So to do that, I would take my whole, I would cut it in half, right? I have two halves now. I'm going to take each half and cut it in half. So now I have quarters, right? I have fourths, 4 equal pieces. I'm going to take each fourth and cut it in half, and that's going to give me my eighths. Think about the pattern you're seeing there with the denominators. Label your unit fraction on all of these, boys and girls. Okay. Now I have 2 extra fraction strips. I'm going to keep those just in case I end up needing them for this lesson. But hopefully you have your fraction bars. And what I want you to do is set these aside and kind of line them up, starting with your whole, and then your halves, and then your thirds, and then your fourths, and then your sixths, and then your eighths, okay? So go ahead and lie those aside, like make a space for them, and lie them aside so that you'll have them if you need them, okay? That's what I'm doing right now off to the side on my table. I'm lying them out, and I did not cut my 6 and my 8s apart because I wanted to save some time here. So I've laying those out. Okay, here we go. Now, right here, if we look, 2 fractions are equivalent, equal to each other, if they have the same part of a whole, okay? So look here, if we're looking at 1/2, 2/4 is equivalent to 1/2 because they have the same part of the whole. That is the same part of the whole as 1/2. So you can tell right here, right where they line up, you can tell that 4/8 is also going to be equivalent to 2/4 or equivalent to 1/2. They are the same part of a whole. You can look here and tell that 2/8 is equivalent to 1/4 because it is the same part of the whole. So right now in today's lesson, we're supposed to be comparing our halves strip and our fourths strip. So if you want to pull those apart or you want to pull those to you, you can like this. Or you can just use the model up there, but I think sometimes it's easier to actually pull these. And if I were you, boys and girls, if you didn't color these and they're just white, I maybe would switch to those colored ones now, even though I asked you to make these because you need the practice on how to do it. But using the colored ones that you had would be easier. I can't find mine right now, so I'm not using mine. But think about how many fourths would be a half. How many fourths would be the same as a half? And I can tell right here, it's going to be 2. 1/4 plus 1/4 is the same as a half. So 2/4 is the same as 1/2. So what would my numerator be here? How many fourths equals 1/2? 2 of them. And then over here I'm going to write 1/4 plus 1/4 equals 1/2. I want you to write that out, boys and girls. It's important. It's an important step for your learning. Okay, how many eighths are in 1/2? How many eighths are in 1/2? So remember, I didn't cut mine apart. You may have. I told you to. You may have to be picking them all up. I'm going to move my fourths out of the way now. And I'm going to lay down my eighths. I'm going to get rid of this half too, because we're just talking about 1/2. So how many halves, or how many eighths rather, are equivalent to the half? 1/8, 2/8, 3/8, 4/8. 4 of them. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 of them. So right here, how many eighths are in 1/2? You're going to say that there are 4 of them. Over here, I would say 1/8 plus 1/8 plus 1/8 plus 1/8 equals, it actually equals 4/8, but that also is equivalent to 1/2. So over here, how many eighths equal 1/2? We already said it. It's 4 of them. 4/8 is equivalent to 1/2. Okay? Important to be using your models to be able to understand that. What 2 fractions are equivalent to 1/2? 2 different fractions that are the same as a half. We just did them. We just said right here, we talked about our fourths and we talked about our eighths. So what 2 fractions are equivalent to 1/2? That would be 2 fourths and 4/8. You may think of another one as well. You may. We did this in class together when we were brainstorming. We talked about how 3/6 would work, right? We talked about how 10/20ths would work. We brainstormed so many of these in class when we weren't even doing this worksheet, boys and girls, but we were already thinking ahead and making so many connections. We talked about the numerator being half of the denominator to be equivalent to a half. How many eighths are in 1/4? So going back up, I'm going to lay my fourth down. How many eighths are in the 4th? So if I'm laying these down, I can clearly see that there are going to be 2 of them. There's going to be 2 of them. 1/8 plus 1/8 equals 2/8, which really equals 1/4. Complete these 2 equations. How many eighths equals 1/4? You should be able to complete that. And you should also be able to complete this right here independently. I'm not going to go over those with you. All right, I'm going to flip over to the back. Now we're talking about thirds and sixths. So I'm going to get those out. I'm going to get my thirds and my sixths out. Okay, I'm going to lay those down up here. Thanks for bearing with me, boys and girls. All right. How many sixths are in 1/3? So if I look at just 1/3, well, you can tell I didn't divide it very well, did I? I guess I was off. Okay, but you can see that it should be what? 1/6 plus 1/6 is my third. So it's 2 of them, right? 2 of them. 1/6 plus 1/6 equals 2/6, which is the same thing as a third. Okay? This is why estimating sometimes, like right there, you can see how far off I was. I was really far off. Really, really far off. In fact, I can tell this is like one of the culprits right here. This one is a lot larger than like down here. Okay, 2/6 is the same as the third. 6 are in 2/3? So how many 6 would be in 2/3? Think about how many 6 are in 1/3. Think about how many are in 1/3. There's 2 of them. So if we double the thirds, we're going to have to double the 6, right? So it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4 of them for that problem here. All right, down to our puzzled penguin. Today, my teacher asked me to name a fraction that's equivalent with 1/2. And I wrote 2/6 is the same as 1/2. Is my answer correct? If not, correct my work and tell me what I did wrong. I'm trying to think about what he did wrong. I have no idea what he did wrong. I'm wondering if you know what he did wrong. All I can think of is that there's a 2 here and a 2 here, but I have no idea what that even means. So I'm thinking they're not. Here's what I am thinking. I am thinking that I would draw 2 different fraction bars right up here. They're going to be the same size. And I'm going to cut one in half, and I'm going to label it 1/2, 1/2. Okay, and now he's using a half, so I'm going to shade half of it. Okay, now the other one, he wants to have 6. So I know half of 6 is 3, right? So I can cut this in half. And now I need to cut each half into thirds. That's pretty equal. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yes, 1/6, 1/6, 1/6, 1/6, 1/6, and 1/6. Now, he shaded 2 of these, boys and girls. Look carefully. Think about what would be equivalent to a half if we're talking about 6. It would be 3 of them, not 2 of them. So when you're telling him what he did wrong, you need to somehow explain that he should have drawn fraction bars like Mrs. Bartell always says. Okay, or you could maybe mention that he didn't use his fraction strips that he had to compare them. So if he actually used his fraction strips that he should have, or if he actually drew fraction bars, like I always recommend doing, he can clearly see that the 1/2 is a lot greater than 2/6. 2/6 is less than 1/2. So you can write that as his explanation. Then I would go on to tell him what really is equivalent to 1/2. How many 6 is equivalent to 1/2? That would be my final step to explain to the puzzled penguin. Okay, boys and girls, I recommend keeping these fraction strips that you made today to use for the future. You're going to want to keep them. And I'm hoping you have the ones that we made in class together out of construction paper, the different colored construction paper. Oh, look, I just found mine. They were under a stack of papers. I'm hoping you have your fraction strips that we made in class together. All right, boys and girls, that's it for today. Bye.